Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
They told me not to come to Christmas this year. Not in a gentle way, not even with that fake politeness families sometimes use when they want to keep the peace, but in the most cutting way possible. My own brother, Mark, smirked across the table and said, "It's no place for losers." That was his exact phrase, delivered like a joke, sharp enough to slice through the laughter that followed. My parents chuckled, my uncle shook his head like Mark was just being his usual self, and my aunt tried to change the subject, but the damage was already done. I sat there, my fork resting on the edge of the plate, and I felt my face grow hot, though not from shame the way he expected. I just nodded, swallowed the rising anger, and thought to myself, fine, let's see how a so-called loser can change the balance of power in this family without lifting her voice. The irony is that for years I had been the silent backbone of his so-called success. Mark liked to present himself as the perfect suburban dad, the guy with the shiny SUV in the driveway, the kids enrolled in private soccer academies, his wife Emily posting Pinterest-worthy photos of their family trips. But behind that polished image was a reality that none of them could have sustained without me. When Emily called me crying one night about her credit card debt, I quietly transferred money into her account. When the kids needed uniforms, field trips, even basic school supplies, I was the one who paid. Mark never knew, and Emily always promised she would tell him one day, but the truth is she was terrified of his pride, and maybe she liked that little safety net too much. I had been covering for his shortfalls for nearly 6 years. At first it was small things, an electric bill here, a late car payment there. Then it snowballed. Mark started assuming the money would appear, as though he had earned it, while still sneering at my supposedly aimless life. I don't have children, and I never married, something that has become the family's favorite conversation topic when they want to explain why I'll never understand real responsibility. But the truth is I understood responsibility far better than any of them, because I had been the one quietly carrying theirs. That Christmas night, when he smirked and declared that losers didn't belong at family gatherings, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I smiled, nodded once, and excused myself early, leaving before dessert. I went home, poured a glass of cheap wine, and sat on the couch staring at the glowing lights of my modest tree. On the surface I was calm, but in my head I was replaying every bill I had paid, every school fee I had covered, every late-night phone call from Emily begging me to help just one more time. The resentment had been building like dry tinder, and Mark's words that night were the spark. I opened my banking app and stared at the list of recurring transfers. There it was, the tuition support, the grocery money, the emergency line I had set up for Emily so she could swipe her card without worrying if it would be declined at the store. My thumb hovered over the cancel button. Part of me hesitated, thinking of the kids, of Emily, of the chaos that would ripple through their lives. But then I remembered the look on Mark's face, the smug confidence of a man who truly believed he was untouchable, who believed I was nothing but background noise in his life story. And with a quiet tap, I canceled every single one. The next morning, I woke up to messages in the family group chat, holiday photos, jokes, the usual chatter. Mark posted a selfie of himself in a red sweater with the caption, "Winners only at Christmas." The comments from relatives were filled with laughing emojis and applause, and for once, I didn't feel that usual twist of humiliation in my gut. I just felt cold clarity. He wanted a world without me? Then let him live in it fully. Over the next few days, I kept my phone close, waiting. I knew Emily would notice quickly. Her calls came sooner than I expected. First, a text, "Hey, did the transfer go through?" I ignored it. Then another, "I think the tuition payment bounced. Did something happen?" Finally, she called late one night, her voice strained and cracking as she asked if I had changed something. I played dumb, feigning surprise, telling her I'd look into it, though I already knew exactly what I had done. When I hung up, I leaned back in bed and let the silence of my apartment settle around me. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Mark thought he had humiliated me. He thought he had finally established himself as the dominant sibling, the winner in some unspoken competition. What he didn't know was that while he laughed at me, his entire image of strength rested on money that had flowed quietly from my account into his household. Now the stream had dried up, and I was going to enjoy watching him discover what it really meant to lose. That night, as I drifted to sleep, I pictured his face when Emily would finally break the news to him. I could almost see his smirk faltering, his confidence cracking. He believed I was powerless, irrelevant, and beneath him. But I knew better. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the things you stop doing. Sometimes revenge is as quiet as a canceled transaction. And by the time he realized it, the ground beneath his feet would already be gone. Emily called the next afternoon while I was at my desk pretending to care about a quarterly report that no one would read twice. Her voice tiptoeing around panic as she told me the tuition portal was flagging their account and that the card she tried had been declined. And although she didn't accuse me directly, I could hear the question pushed between her words like a folded note no one wanted to unfold. So I said I would check on my end and murmured that banks sometimes hold transactions around holidays, which bought me a little silence and a sigh but no resolution, because the truth was never going to be a technical glitch. It was going to be the first domino falling exactly as planned. By dinner time, the family group chat warmed up like a cheap radiator, everyone sharing photos of leftovers reborn into casseroles, while Mark posted a boisterous reminder that winners just keep winning, and if his joke stung anyone beyond me, they didn't show it. Yet not 10 minutes later I saw Emily typing, stopping, typing again, finally sending a carefully upbeat message asking if anyone had a good contact at the school billing office, because we're having one of those silly login issues. Which made me smile in the melon-bitter way you smile when a truth you've carried for years begins to show its face under fluorescent lighting. I knew how these things spread in their suburban world where everyone's lawn is mowed to the same anxious height and every problem is called a hiccup until it's an ambulance. So when the soccer coach, a relentlessly upbeat man named Trevor who wore visors like a personality, emailed the team parents about renewing the anonymous scholarship fund that covered 2 kids' training fees, I replied from my personal address and thanked him for managing the paperwork these past few years, then added that unfortunately I would need to step back from sponsorship this season, and that if he needed any documentation for the transition I could send it privately. I signed my full name without flourish, knowing that Trevor might not connect the dots immediately, but that his wife, who ran the carpool text chain like air traffic control, certainly would. The first fracture appeared 2 days later at my mother's kitchen table, where the coffee is always overbrewed and the advice is always undercooked, when my aunt mentioned hearing that the scholarship angel on the soccer team had retired from philanthropy and that it was a shame given how much good it had done for the Wilson kids and, well, for Mark's son too, and I watched my mother's eyes flick to mine like a skater considering thin ice, calculating whether she wanted to step there or pretend she hadn't noticed the shimmer, while I stirred my coffee and asked if anyone knew who the angel had been, because people who do that sort of thing deserve thanks. Which was true in a way that made my aunt nod vigorously, and my mother changed the subject to weather as if rain could launder the topic into something harmless. Emily tried texting me again that night, a longer message this time explaining that the after-school program had a wait list, and if the tuition wasn't resolved by the end of the week the kids would lose their spots. And that Mark was under a lot of pressure with his sales targets, and that Christmas had just been a joke taken too far, and maybe we could sit down and talk. Maybe we could reset, which was her diplomatic word for please put the rug back over the hole. And I answered with a gentle deflection about being swamped with work, adding that I was sure Mark would figure it out because he always said winners figure things out. I put the phone face down and let the quiet swell until it felt like a heavy blanket I'd finally earned the right to pull over my shoulders. When Friday rolled around, the school sent out a general newsletter with a smiling principal and a paragraph about unexpected changes to scholarship funds, and Mark burst into the family chat with a tirade about administrative incompetence, slamming the school, the economy, and anyone who didn't value hard-working fathers, and for the first time his display performed an unintended trick. It made people look at him rather than through him, which is dangerous when your armor is performative. confidence, and your life is financed by invisible scaffolding, because once the crowd stops clapping, the trapeze looks awfully high. I ran into Emily at the grocery store on Saturday, her cart half full of generic brands and apology eyes, and she hugged me too tightly in the cereal aisle as if she could squeeze a solution out of me, whispering that Mark had been snapping at the kids and sleeping on the couch, and that if I could float them, just for a month, she would figure out something permanent. And even though a softer part of me tugged toward mercy, I remembered the red sweater selfie and the chorus of relatives applauding his winners-only Christmas, so I told her kindly that I couldn't be the solution this time, and that maybe the most permanent thing would be an honest conversation about who had been paying for what. At which she pulled back like a person who has touched a burner and hoped the heat was imagined. That night I sent one email that tasted like a risk and a treat at once, a short, polite note to Trevor confirming that the scholarship line item tied to Wilson family and Mark's son had originated from me directly, and that any thank yous should be addressed accordingly, not because I wanted applause, but because attribution is a solvent that strips varnish from pretended generosity. And on Sunday, when Trevor sent a team-wide message thanking our past sponsor, Anna Mitchell, for quietly carrying more than one player for more than one season, the replies flowed in with gratitude and surprise, and Mark's name never appeared, yet somehow he was everywhere in the stunned silence that took over our group chat. He texted me privately after midnight, not with the swagger of a winner, but with a clipped fury that pretended to be confusion, asking why the coach would write something misleading and whether I had said anything. And I typed back with careful slowness that I had only clarified where the payments had come from because people were asking, which was true in the way a knife is honest about being sharp. Then I watched the typing bubbles flare and vanish before his final line arrived. He wanted to meet in person, he said, because we need to talk like adults, and while I laughed at the bedside glow of that phrase, I also felt the shift in air that precedes a summer storm. Since meetings between adults who have built their identities on borrowed foundations rarely end with the weather holding steady, and I already knew where I wanted ours to begin. A cafe across from the school, at a time when parents queued with late checks and thin smiles. Because sometimes the most instructive mirror is a window everyone else can see through. He chose the corner table the way a man chooses a hill he plans to defend with the last of his pride, crisp polo, jaw clenched, the smile he used to sell software stretched too tight. And as I sat down with the coffee I had already ordered because I wanted to own the quiet between us, he launched into a speech about misunderstandings and reputations, and how the coach's email had created optics that were less than ideal for a father who had worked very hard to provide, and I let him roll through the greatest hits of his self-image while the line of parents behind me murmured to the registrar about late fees and partial payments. The hum of real life fraying the edges of his stock phrases until they sounded like a motivational poster left too long in the sun. He asked if I had told anyone I had been helping them, rolling that word in his mouth like a pill he refused to swallow. And I said I had answered a direct question from the person who handled the billing because it seemed important that he know who the sponsor had been. And if the truth had made anyone uncomfortable, then perhaps the discomfort belonged to the stories people had told themselves about who was carrying what, which was the most polite way I could express the obvious without shoving it down his throat, something I knew he would never forgive even though I had every right to. He tried the brother card next, the one where family loyalty demands silence from the person who has supplied the invisible labor, and I said loyalty is not a blanket to suffocate accountability. And if he wanted to talk about loyalty, we could talk about Christmas, and the way our mother narrowed her eyes at me when the word loser landed on my plate like a tossed bone. Or we could talk about the 6 years I had watched his home operate on the credit of my patience while he performed victory laps on social media, and at that he glanced toward the window where a parade of minivans idled like worried cattle, and I could feel his mind scraping for an exit that would not require humility. He lowered his voice and asked me to restart the transfers for a month, maybe 2, just until commissions hit and bonuses landed, and when I said that the transfers had not been a policy but a kindness, and that kindness had an expiration date that he himself had stamped with his Christmas remark, He called me cold, which was funny in the way an arsonist calls the fire department inefficient. And I told him that what he felt as cold was actually the temperature of his own reflection finally crawling across the glass. Emily came in halfway through, pale and hopeful and carrying a folder so thick it made her wrist bend, and she asked if we could all sit together and reset expectations, which is the language people use when they know they have been caught relying on miracles and would like to renegotiate with the sky. And she laid out the tuition notices, the utility threats, the overdraft warnings with their politely urgent fonts. And she murmured that the kids did not need to be punished for adult pride. And I agreed about the kids while also noting that adult pride had been the engine pulling a train fed by my fuel, and that engines running on borrowed fuel do not get to schedule the refill anymore. I told her I would help her map a budget if she wanted, that I would sit with her and call the billing offices to set up realistic plans, that I would even connect her to a counselor who worked with families crawling out of the sticky web of image debt, but that I would not, under any circumstance, restart the invisible pipeline that allowed Mark to sneer at me while enjoying the comfort my bank account had made possible, and if that distinction sounded harsh, then perhaps it was the necessary border between support and enabling, a line that had been invisible for too long. He called me vindictive in a tone that pretended to be righteous, and I said vindictive would be broadcasting his balances to the family chat with screenshots and captions, whereas I had simply stopped participating in a play where my name was not in the program. And if my refusal looked like vengeance, then maybe the mirror was finally hanging at the right height, and as his mouth opened and closed around a retort he could not quite grip, the registrar behind me announced that the waitlist for spring programs had advanced by 3 spots, and 2 mothers cheered softly while a third whispered a relieved prayer, and I watched the realization crawl up his neck as he understood that when my sponsorship left, other children stepped into the light. I had brought one envelope because revenge, when it wants to teach rather than merely scorch, enjoys paperwork, and I slid it across the table to Emily while Mark pretended not to flinch. And inside was a letter I had drafted to the school fund formalizing the redirection of my annual support toward a named scholarship for families with documented need, with a modest requirement that recipients write a thank you note to any person who had previously covered their fees anonymously, not to me specifically, but to whichever neighbor had quietly kept their kid on the field, because I wanted the habit of gratitude to grow where secrecy had starved it, and I wanted the lesson to land where it was owed. He said I was trying to humiliate him, and I told him humiliation is the feeling your ego experiences when accountability walks in wearing its sensible shoes, and that I hoped he could use the friction to find traction rather than simply smoke out. And then I stood, left cash for my coffee, and told Emily to call me later about the budget template I would share if she decided she was ready to rebuild on something sturdier than Mark's declarations. As I reached the door, I paused because I had almost forgotten the small, precise blade I had planned for dessert, and I turned back and said that since the scholarship fund had already processed my redirection, the coach's discretionary pool would be able to place 2 kids immediately, and that one of those slots had been offered to the son of a woman who cleaned houses on our street and had never once pretended her life was anything other than hard. And I watched Mark digest the image of a lawn guy's kid dribbling where his son might not, saw the flush rise that always accompanies the first time a man realizes the ladder beneath him was not entirely his, and I left him there holding his pride like a leaky bucket. While in my pocket my phone buzzed with a new email from the coach asking me, very politely, whether I preferred the scholarship plaque to include my name or remain in the quiet column, and I smiled at the phrasing because it meant the story was changing tone, then stepped into the cold air already planning the next move, a move that would not just close the tap but make him walk to the well in front of everyone, the kind of errand that turns a winner's grin into a prayer whispered to no one in particular. The following week unfolded like a slow unraveling of a badly sewn seam, each day pulling another thread from the costume my brother had been parading around in for years. And by the time Friday arrived, his once carefully curated image of competence and charm looked more like a stage prop collapsing in front of an audience too polite to boo but too restless to clap. Emily's eyes grew hollow with fatigue, The children carried resentment in their hunched shoulders, as if they could already sense that the castle of stability they had been raised in was made of cardboard. And Mark himself moved like a man trying to keep his balance on ice that he knew was about to give way, his smile flashing in public places, but cracking the moment he thought no one was looking. One night, when the winter air was biting enough to sting my lungs on the short walk home, he called me from the parking lot of some chain restaurant where his colleagues had gathered for drinks, his voice dragging against the edges of desperation as he admitted that his credit card had been declined in front of everyone and he needed me to wire something quick just to hold him over until Monday. Because apparently the shame of being the man who could not buy a round of beers was sharper than the humiliation of begging the sister he had called a loser only weeks before. I listened in silence, letting the weight of his panic sink into the quiet space between us, and when I finally answered, it was not with anger, but with a calmness that I knew would cut far deeper, telling him that he had always been the clever one, the resourceful one, the winner, and if anyone could find a way through this temporary inconvenience, it had to be him. He hung up without saying goodbye, and I could picture him standing in the dim light of that parking lot, his breath fogging, his hands shaking against the cold metal of his car, realizing for the first time that the rope he thought he was holding had already slipped from his grasp. The following day, my parents called me to say that Mark had been going through something, and maybe I could extend an olive branch, because after all, family is family. And I bit back the laugh that wanted to escape as I asked whether they had said the same to him after Christmas dinner when he smirked and told me I did not belong. My mother hesitated, then shifted the topic to how stress affects people differently, how maybe he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, but the truth is my family has always been skilled at rewriting the script once the consequences arrive, as if the past can be softened by erasing its sharpest edges. I let them talk. Let them plead for reconciliation, and then I told them I was not withholding kindness. I was withholding the kind of blind subsidy that turns arrogance into entitlement. And that if Mark was struggling, maybe the most loving thing any of us could do was stop cushioning him against the fall he had been begging for his entire adult life. By Sunday evening, the whispers had spread through our extended relatives, the cousins and in-laws who had always admired Mark for his career, his house, his easy jokes at the dinner table. People began asking quiet questions. Why had the bank repossessed the second car? Why were the kids suddenly pulled from their expensive extracurriculars? Why did Emily show up to church wearing the same dress 3 weeks in a row when she used to rotate like a catalog model? I didn't have to say anything. Silence has a way of creating its own story, and the absence of my money was already painting a portrait more powerful than any words I could have chosen. When I saw him at our mother's house that week, he tried to corner me in the hallway, the mask gone, his voice raw as he admitted that he was drowning. He wanted to know why I was doing this to him, as if I had taken something that belonged to him rather than simply closing my wallet. I looked him in the eye and told him that all I had done was remove myself from his stage, and if the set collapsed when I walked away, maybe the structure had never been as strong as he wanted everyone to believe. He cursed under his breath, called me cruel, said that I had no idea what it was like to carry the weight of a family, and I leaned close enough for him to smell the wine on my breath and told him he was right. I didn't carry the weight of a family. I carried the weight of his. The days that followed carried the rhythm of unraveling desperation, late-night calls I ignored, tense family dinners where my parents tried to force civility into conversations that collapsed under their own weight, and Emily arriving at my apartment once with tear-streaked cheeks, confessing that Mark had been screaming at shadows, blaming everyone but himself, terrified that people were finally seeing through the act. I made her tea, sat her down, and told her she deserved honesty, not performance, and if she chose to keep living in a house built on illusions, then the splinters were hers to accept. She nodded, said nothing, and stared into the steam as if she could find her future there. By the end of that week, Mark was no longer angry so much as hollow, his voice thin when he called me one last time and said he was sorry, though the apology was laced with resentment, a confession designed less to heal than to bargain. He asked again for a small loan, just enough to keep things afloat until he could regain momentum, and when I said no, his silence stretched so long I thought he might hang up, but instead he whispered, almost to himself, that maybe I was right. Maybe he had built everything on nothing, and then he ended the call. I sat there staring at my phone in the dim light of my kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, wondering whether I had finally broken him or whether he had broken himself long ago, and I had merely stopped hiding the pieces. Either way, I knew this wasn't the end. It never is when pride is involved. And as I washed my glass and turned off the light, I could feel the air shifting toward another storm, one that would not be contained by silence or subtlety, because men like my brother don't just crumble quietly, they claw at the walls as they go down, determined to take someone with them. Christmas came around like a clock that refuses to break even when you beg it to stop, the same brittle cookies on the same chipped plate, the same garland that shed on the tablecloth like a tired dog. The same chairs pulled close enough to touch knees and still pretend there was space between us, and although no one said the word loser out loud, I could hear it hanging in the room like a scent people pretend not to notice. Which is why I arrived 5 minutes late carrying nothing but a small folder and the kind of calm you earn when you have already decided how the evening ends regardless of who throws the first stone. I had spent the past week finishing something that had lived in my head as a sketch for months, a version of help that would never again pass through my brother's hands on its way to the people who actually needed it. And even as the front door opened and my mother's smile tried to wrap me in gauze, I felt the steel of that decision harden, not cruel, not triumphant. Simply inevitable in the way a locked door is inevitable after the night you forget to turn the deadbolt and wake to footprints in your hallway. Mark stood by the tree in a sweater that had looked better on last year's jokes, his face thinner, the jaw set, the smile working too hard, and next to him Emily hovered with the kids who were learning to read a room faster than most adults learn a book. And I watched how they kept their voices soft as if loudness might crack something fragile, and I wondered if they could sense the same thin ice I felt beneath all our shoes, the glossy surface of denial that will hold if everyone walks gently, and catastrophically fail if someone jumps. We ate. We performed civility like actors who know the play cannot be saved, but will finish it anyway, and when dessert arrived my father made a fumbling speech about family being a rope you hold even in bad weather, which made my aunt dab her eyes and my mother glance at me as if she could will me to nod, and perhaps in a different year I would have nodded to get through it, but this year the folder on my lap felt heavier than the pie on my plate, so I set down my fork, stood, and asked for 2 minutes of everyone's patience, which achieved what years of biting my tongue never did, silence that wasn't empty, silence that hummed with dread. I said I wanted to clarify something that had become a rumor with legs. That for several years I had provided financial support to Emily and the children for specific needs that were sometimes called scholarships and sometimes called miracles, and were most accurately called bills, and while my intention had been to help without spectacle, the consequence of secrecy had been a story in which the wrong character took the bow, so I had changed the arrangement in a way that would protect the right people without requiring me to fund the wrong performance, and at this point Mark tried to interrupt to insist that the coach had misunderstood and that people loved to misinterpret generosity and that optics were never the full truth. But I kept my eyes on Emily and the kids as I kept speaking, because if the truth belonged anywhere, it belonged to them. I opened the folder and slid 3 documents onto the table like thin anchors, the first a notice from a local bank establishing a trust in the children's names funded for a period sufficient to keep them in their programs and cover school-related expenses without delays or middlemen. The second, a letter from a financial counselor who had already agreed to help Emily with budgeting and debt negotiation at no cost to her for the first year. And the third, a simple statement authorizing a capped monthly grocery stipend paid directly to the store rather than any personal account, all of it designed to bypass the bottleneck that had clogged every dollar with pride until it suffocated, none of it requiring so much as a text from Mark to function. The room did that thing rooms do when the air changes altitude, a soft intake like everyone had walked up a flight of stairs they hadn't noticed, and while my mother looked relieved in the naked way only mothers can, and my father stared at the paper as if it were written in an alphabet he had never learned, and my aunt whispered something about angels again like she had at the kitchen table, Mark laughed. Not because he was amused, but because men laugh sometimes when they realize the ceiling is closer than they thought, and he said I was undermining his authority in his own house, that I was doing this to humiliate him, that I had no idea what it meant to have a family depending on you. And I told him that I understood dependence intimately because I had borne it financially while he held it theatrically, and that this structure removed the performance while preserving the support, which is what any adult who actually loved his family would want. And if the loss of control felt like humiliation, perhaps that feeling could be repurposed into responsibility, since those two are cousins whether we acknowledge it or not. Emily reached for the papers with fingers that trembled and did not let go once they landed, her mouth opening and closing like she was relearning speech, and she whispered thank you in a tone that was neither triumphant nor apologetic, but simply exhausted. A thank you that did not excuse the years of secrecy yet also did not weaponize them, and I felt something unclench in my chest that I had not admitted was clenched, because the truth is I had wanted to help the kids without making Emily choose between loyalty and survival, and the old way had demanded choices she should never have had to make. Mark called me manipulative again and accused me of turning his family against him, and I said that paper cannot turn people against anyone, it can only reveal the traffic pattern of money. And if the new map shows a route that avoids the toll booth he had installed under the sign of his pride, then perhaps we could all reach the destination without more crashes. I did not expect applause and I did not receive it. What I received was a slow rearrangement of faces, the kind that happens when everyone recalculates their private definitions of winner and loser. And when the murmurs died down, the house settled into a quiet more honest than any grace we had said before dinner, at which point I added the part one had almost decided to keep to myself, that the trust contained a condition written in the plainest language a banker could manage, a modest requirement that any additional funds released for non-essential activities would follow proof of family counseling attended by both parents for a minimum period, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement that money can bandage bruises without healing bones. And if that sounded paternal or arrogant, then I would accept the insult, because perhaps arrogance in service of the children was the final petty sin I was willing to commit this year. He stared at me across the table, eyes rimmed with red, the muscles in his jaw fluttering like trapped moths, and for a second I thought he might flip the table or storm out or deliver some grand speech that would shatter the glass of my decision. But instead he did something smaller and stranger. He sat down slowly and pressed 2 fingers to his temple as if the truth were a headache that might pass if he didn't move. Then he looked up and said in a voice so thin I almost missed it that he didn't know how we got here, and I told him I did, and that the road had been paved with jokes dressed as knives and compliments that arrived with a bill attached, and with the quiet I had given him for years, which had allowed the echo of his own applause to sound like a crowd. The kids asked if they would still play in the spring, and I told them yes without looking at him, which felt like both a rescue and a betrayal, depending on which angle you preferred, and maybe that is the point I will not resolve for anyone, not even myself. When the night ended and coats were pulled from the hooks and the tree lights dimmed with that sleepy flicker houses have after long conversations, he walked me to the door with a steadiness I did not expect, and he said my name once, just once, but didn't add anything. And I realized that sometimes the sincerest apology a person like my brother can manage is the restraint not to speak when speaking would be another performance, so I nodded because I am not immune to small mercies, then stepped into the crisp dark and felt the city breathe. I know there are people who will say I weaponized generosity, that I cut off a man and made his children feel the cold so he would finally buy a coat, and I cannot argue them into comfort because I am not entirely comfortable myself. Yet when I picture those trust papers and the clinic address and the grocery credit that bypasses ego, I think maybe I traded spectacle for structure and cruelty for a kind of boundary that will look like love from a distance. Whether I saved them or broke something that cannot be repaired is a verdict I will not receive tonight, perhaps not ever, and as the wind lifted a strand of hair across my mouth I tasted the old word he had tried to pin on me and found that it no longer fit. Not because I had one, but because I had stopped playing his game and written a quieter one where the scoreboard is hidden and the only way to know the ending is to live in it.